Welcome to the Slumbering Times, where we dive into the gritty tale of the real Peaky Blinders, those razor-sharp gangsters from Birmingham who decided peaked caps were the height of fashion. Expect a story of rise, rackets, and ruin, with enough twists to make a corkscrew jealous. Who knew organized crime could be so disorganized? Grab your flat cap, settle in for a relaxing bedtime history lesson, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell, or we'll send the lads round. Part 1. The Forge of the Streets. Birmingham, in the late 1880s, was a monster of a city, swallowing up the English Midlands like a hungry beast, its guts churning with the fire of factories and the sweat of thousands crammed into a landscape that had ballooned from a sleepy market town of 73,000 souls in 1801 to over 500,000 by the decade's end. The Industrial Revolution had turned it into the workshop of the world, a title earned through endless rows of ironworks, gun factories and metal shops that supplied the British Empire's insatiable demand for tools, weapons and trinkets. Small Heath, a working-class enclave on the east side, was the underbelly of this beast. Row houses jammed together like crooked teeth, their brick walls blackened by soot from chimneys that never stopped belching. The streets were narrow labyrinths of cobblestones, slick with rain or the grimy spill from factories, where horse carts clattered by day and drunks staggered by night. The air hung heavy with coal smoke and the metallic tang of iron, a constant reminder that progress came at the price of lungs filled with grime and backs broken from 12-hour shifts. The River Rhea snaked through, its waters brown and sluggish from industrial waste, a natural divider between neighbourhoods that also served as a dumping ground for everything from factory runoff to the occasional body. Poverty clung to the place like the fog that rolled in from the canals, those man-made veins dug in the late 1700s to haul coal and goods faster than roads ever could, linking Birmingham to the national network and fueling its explosive growth. Disease lurked in the cramped tenements, where tuberculosis and cholera spread like gossip, and families of 8 or more shared 2 rooms, their windows dim with the glow of cheap oil lamps. Women scrubbed laundry in communal yards, their hands raw from lye, while children dodged carts in the alleys, their games a brief escape from the grind. Men trudged to work at places like the Birmingham Small Arms Company, founded in 1861 to churn out rifles for the Empire's wars, only to return home with empty pockets and aching bones. It was in this cauldron of desperation that the Peaky Blinders bubbled up, not as some romantic band of rebels, but as a ragtag crew of lads figuring out how to snatch a slice of the pie before it got gobbled by the bosses or crushed under the heel of the law. The gang's origins were about as organized as a drunkard's stagger through a fog-shrouded alley. It all kicked off in the late 1880s with a handful of young men from the poorest corners of Small Heath, where opportunity meant dodging the foreman's whip or pilfering scraps from the factory yard. Thomas Gilbert, in his early 20s, was the spark plug of the bunch. Built sturdy from hauling iron at the BSA factory, a massive complex that turned out rifles for the British Army, he had a scar across his cheek from a childhood tumble off a coal cart, the kind of mark that said, "Life's been kicking me since day one." His eyes were sharp as a pickpocket's fingers, always scanning for the next edge in a city where the rich got richer on the backs of the poor. Gilbert lived with his widowed mother in a 2-room hovel where the roof leaked like a sieve during Birmingham's frequent downpours, forcing them to place buckets strategically around the floor. "Our own little rain orchestra," he'd quip with a bitter edge. He wasn't in it for glory. A beating from older lads over a disputed apple cart left him limping for days, and he swore, "Next time, I'll be the one leaving marks." His leadership emerged from sheer pragmatism. He started gathering the others for mutual protection, setting loose rules like no nicking from locals, only outsiders, to avoid turning the neighborhood against them. "We're not saints," he'd say with a sardonic smirk, "but we're not stupid either." Kevin Mooney was the gang's enforcer, a lanky 19-year-old whose hands were rough as sandpaper from loading crates at a canal-side warehouse, a key part of Birmingham's 100-mile canal network. Mooney's temper was legendary, the kind that flared over a misplaced glance or a short-changed wage. Once, he punched a co-worker for bumping his elbow, earning a suspension and a nickname: Lightning Kevin. He joined after a rival group swiped his boots in the dead of winter, forcing him to wrap his feet in rags. "I'll make 'em regret it," he growled, and when Gilbert recruited him, Mooney found an outlet for his fury. His loyalty was fierce, but his hot-headedness often landed them in scrapes. Gilbert would sigh, "You're like a bull in a china shop, Kevin, but at least you're our bull." His role was vital in a city where physical strength meant survival, especially with the influx of Irish immigrants like his family, who'd arrived in the 1840s fleeing famine and adding to the labour pool, sparking occasional tensions over jobs. Thomas Mucklow brought the brains. He lived in a shared tenement with his sister Mary, sleeping on a pallet by the hearth where the fire barely warded off the chill. Mucklow had a knack for details, honed from reading discarded newspapers in the streets. "Life's a game of hide-and-seek with poverty," he'd say with a dry laugh, sketching maps on scraps of paper by candlelight. His sister Mary, 18, was the unsung hero, working as a laundress during the day, her hands raw from lye soap and endless scrubbing. She lived in the same tenement, her room a clutter of baskets and drying lines, but she kept the gang's secrets safe, hiding stolen goods in laundry piles or passing messages disguised as shopping lists. "If the coppers come sniffing, I'll drown 'em in suds," she'd quip, her voice carrying an edge of defiance earned from years of scraping by. Mary's quick thinking once saved them. She hid stolen coins in a hollowed-out boot during a police search, smiling innocently as officers poked around. The gang's formation was less a master plan and more a series of why-not moments in the back alleys of Small Heath. It began with casual chats in an alley behind a butcher's shop, where the smell of raw meat mingled with the boys' cigarette smoke and the drip of rainwater from overhanging roofs. Gilbert, Mooney, Mucklow, and a few others would gather to complain about bosses or share tips on snatching extra bread from market stalls. "If we're getting beaten anyway, might as well beat back together," Gilbert said one rainy afternoon, after a foreman had docked their pay for a broken tool they didn't break. The idea stuck, and they began meeting regularly, their peaked caps tilted low to hide their faces from prying eyes. Those caps, cheap and common among factory workers, became their signature. "Like a crown, but cheaper and sharper," Mucklow joked, though the razor myth would come later, a tall tale born from newspaper sensationalism. Daily life in Small Heath was a grind that could break a man or make him join a gang. Mornings were a scramble. Gilbert woke to the clang of factory bells at 5 a.m., gulping down watery porridge before heading to the BSA, where the heat from the forges burned his skin and the noise rattled his bones. "Another day in paradise," he'd mutter to himself, dodging carts loaded with gun parts. Mooney hauled crates at a warehouse, his back aching by noon, often snapping at co-workers over minor slights, like a spilled lunch pail. "Life's too short for bad boots and worse bosses," he'd grumble, his Irish lilt standing out in the English crowd. Women like Mary rose before dawn to boil laundry water, her arms sore from stirring, yet she'd slip a few pennies from her wages to buy bread for the gang. "If I can clean bloodstains, I can clean up your messes," she'd say with a wink. The afternoons were for mischief, stealing a loaf from a baker's cart or picking pockets at the market, where the smell of fresh bread clashed with the stink of fish guts. One time, Mooney snatched a pie, only to drop it when a dog barked, leading to a chase that ended with him laughing, pieless but alive. "Dessert's overrated anyway," he quipped. Their first structured job was a farce that somehow worked. In 1890, they targeted a card game in a pub called the Black Horse, a dingy spot with sticky floors and smoke so thick it could hide a horse. The pub was a hub for locals escaping the factories, its air reeking of ale and unwashed bodies. The gang, now about 8 strong, crashed the game, demanding a cut. The players, a mix of factory workers and drunks, laughed at first. "You kids think you're tough," one sneered. Gilbert stepped forward, his voice even. "Tough enough to take what's ours." Mooney cracked his knuckles, and Mucklow had already pocketed the cards. The fight was over in minutes. A few shoves, a broken chair, and they walked away with a handful of coins and a bottle of gin. "We're the kings of the alley now," Gilbert said, clinking glasses later, though Mooney added with a snort, "Kings with empty pockets and full egos." The gang grew through word of mouth. A kid named Sam, 18 with a limp from a factory accident, joined after the Blinders helped him get back stolen wages. "They're like family, but with knives," he told his brother. Recruitment was selective. Gilbert vetted them for loyalty, turning away hotheads who'd bring trouble. "We're smart thugs, not dumb ones," he'd say. By 1893 they numbered 15, mostly from small heath families. A daily routine solidified. Mornings were for work, Gilbert at the factory bending metal and plotting. Mooney hauled crates, his temper flaring when a co-worker shoved him. "A job's worse than a bad date, long and painful," he grumbled. Mucklow threaded machines, his eyes on the clock. Mary scrubbed, her thoughts on the gang's next move. Afternoons brought sparring in an empty lot where they practiced swings with sticks, the thud of wood mixing with grunts. One day, Mooney tripped over a root. "Graceful as a drunk ox," Mucklow quipped, earning laughs. Evenings were for meetings in the alley, Gilbert planning, Mooney arguing, Mary suggesting. The warehouse heist of 1892 marked a pivotal leap for the Peaky Blinders, transforming them from a loose band of alley scrappers into a coordinated outfit with real ambitions, a rite of passage that proved their planning could outpace the city's watchful eyes and cemented Gilbert's leadership in the eyes of his crew. The tip-off came from a disgruntled night watchman at the Birmingham Small Arms Company. The watchman, bitter over unpaid wages amid Birmingham's booming arms trade, whispered details to Mucklow in a smoky pub corner for a cut of the take. Mucklow planned the whole affair over late-night sketches in their tenement hideout, mapping the layout of the warehouse, a cavernous brick building on the canal's edge, stacked floor to ceiling with valuable metal tools, drills and gun parts, worth a small fortune on the black market. Guarded by a single patrolman and locked gates that creaked like old bones. The risks were as thick as the fog rolling off the Raya. A wrong step could alert the guard, bringing police whistles shrilling through the night, or worse, a scuffle that might leave them bleeding in the mud. Birmingham's constabulary had ramped up patrols after a spate of thefts tied to the 1890 economic dip, when factory slowdowns left men desperate. "We hit the warehouse at midnight," Gilbert said one night in the back room of the garrison, his voice low as the group huddled around Mucklow's map, the air heavy with cigarette smoke and the distant rumble of a passing train. Under cover of that pea-soup fog, they snuck in like shadows. Mucklow picking the lock with a wire twisted from a fence, Mooney hoisting the crates with his lanky arms straining, but silent. Gilbert keeping watch with his scar twitching in the chill. The heist went smooth as silk. They grabbed tools enough to fill 2 carts, slipping out along the canal's dark path, without a soul stirring. The hall fenced to a shady dealer in the jewellery quarter, a district famed for its goldsmiths since the 18th century, but now a hub for under-the-table trades. The total profit came to £50, a king's ransom for lads used to scraping shillings, enough to buy new boots, bribe a cop or two, and stock the safe houses, boosting morale and proving that smart thievery could elevate them above the daily grind of factory drudgery. "We're not just surviving anymore, we're thriving on the scraps they leave behind," Gilbert remarked later, clinking glasses, though Mooney added with a snort, "Thriving. We're just better at being broke." This job wasn't just a score. It forged the gang's confidence, drawing in more recruits and setting the stage for bolder ventures, all while the city's elite turned a blind eye, too busy profiting from the empire's wars to notice the shadows lengthening in their own backyard. A fierce rivalry simmered between the emerging Peaky Blinders gang and the Cheapside Sloggers, a rough-and-tumble crew from a neighbouring district known for their brute strength and dominance in local betting circles. The tension boiled over during a muddy field skirmish near the sluggish brown waters of the River Raya, sparked by a disputed horse race bet at a nearby track, where the Blinders accused the Sloggers of rigging odds to cheat them out of their winnings. The field, a desolate stretch of churned earth on the outskirts of Small Heath, was slick with rain-soaked mud, the air heavy with the damp scent of wet grass and the distant clang of factory machinery, making every step a treacherous dance under a grey, overcast sky. As the clash erupted, Thomas Gilbert deftly dodged a wild punch from a burly slogger, countering with a precise jab to the jaw, his movements calculated despite the slippery ground. Nearby, Kevin Mooney fearlessly tackled a slogger twice his size, bringing the man down into the mire with a thud. Meanwhile, Thomas Mucklow wielded a broken tree branch to fend off a pair of attackers, his quick thinking turning the tide. The fight concluded with the Sloggers retreating in disarray, their pride bruised and their ranks thinned, but not without cost. A Blinders member named Sam, a young recruit with a wiry frame and nervous eyes, suffered a deep knife cut to his arm, blood staining his sleeve as he staggered back. Later, in a cramped tenement room lit by a sputtering hearth, Mary wrapped Sam's wound with a tight face of worry, her voice cutting through the tension as she muttered, "You lot are idiots," though her hands moved with gentle precision. The victory expanded the Blinders' turf along the riverbanks, a hard-won gain that boosted their reputation, but the injuries, Sam's cut and the gang's collective bruises, slowed their momentum. As Gilbert wrapped a shallow cut on his own hand, he remarked with a grim nod, "We held our ground, but let's not make a habit of bleeding for fun," his voice carrying the weight of their costly triumph. The Blinders' style became known, their peaked caps tilted, trousers tight, boots polished. They controlled gambling in Small Heath, running games in pubs. Profits came in, enough for meat pies or a night's ale. Gilbert invested in a small pub stake, using it as a base. Society was changing. The Industrial Revolution's effects lingered. Long hours, low pay, resentment. Immigrants from Ireland added to the population, sometimes sparking tensions but also alliances. Women like Mary took on more roles, like managing safe houses. The Blinders offered protection in a lawless area, but also fear, balancing community support with intimidation. The gang adapted, shifting to less visible crimes like fixed boxing matches. Daily life continued with small adventures. Gilbert fixed a neighbour's door, earning goodwill. "A favour's worth more than a fist," he said. Mooney sparred with new recruits, teaching holds. "Hit hard, but hit smart," he advised. Mucklow read newspapers, spotting police patterns. "Knowledge is the best weapon," he claimed. Mary cooked stew, sharing with the gang. "Eat up, can't fight on empty stomachs," she'd say. As 1900 approached, the gang faced new pressures. Police increased patrols, and rival groups grew bolder. Gilbert knew they needed to adapt. "We evolve or die," he said one night, the river's flow steady beside him. Part 2. The Reign of Shadows. The fog that rolled in over Small Heath that night in 1890, as Mooney leaned against a wall nursing his bruises from the Sloggers' brawl, seemed to herald a shift in the winds for the Peaky Blinders, a shift from scrappy upstarts to the undisputed overlords of Birmingham's shadowy corners. The city itself was no innocent bystander in this ascent. Birmingham in the 1890s was a throbbing heart of empire, pumping out guns, tools, and machinery that armed Britain's colonial grabs in Africa and Asia, its population swelling to nearly 523,000 by 1891, as workers flooded in from rural England and Ireland. Small Heath, with its warren of alleys and tenements, became the gang's kingdom, the River Raya's murky flow a moat against intruders, while the canals, those artificial veins carved in the 18th century to shuttle coal from the Black Country, served as their secret highways for smuggling and quick getaways. The air was perpetually laced with the acrid bite of molten iron from factories like the Kinnock Works, established in 1862 and churning out ammunition for the Zulu War, a conflict that had ended just a decade earlier in 1879, leaving Birmingham's arms industry hungry for more contracts. Socio-politically, the city simmered with unrest. The general strike of 1889 had seen thousands walk off jobs demanding better wages, a harbinger of labour tensions that the Blinders exploited, positioning themselves as guardians of the working man against greedy bosses. Though, as Gilbert would wryly note, we're just the tax collectors they like a bit more than the official ones. Thomas Gilbert, now a mid-twenties veteran of too many back-alley tussles, had sharpened his leadership into a fine art. His scar, a jagged reminder of that clumsy cart incident, had become a badge he wore like a medal, and his eyes darted with the precision of a man who knew the difference between a mark and a trap. He upgraded from his mother's leaky hovel to a slightly less leaky flat above a tobacconist's, where the scent of pipe leaf wafted up through the floorboards, giving his mornings a hazy start. Gilbert's routine was a masterclass in calculated chaos. He'd sip bitter tea while reviewing scribbled ledgers of bets and debts, muttering, "Money's like a bad guest. It never stays long enough." He pushed the gang into gambling rackets, seeing the city's obsession with horse races and boxing matches as a gold mine waiting to be mined. "Why risk your neck robbing when folks hand over their shillings for a thrill?" he'd quip to recruits, his grin disarming as a loaded pistol. Kevin Mooney, 24, and built like a human battering ram, had channeled his explosive temper into a tool of terror for rivals, his hands now a canvas of scars from factory gears and fistfights alike. Mooney's days blended labour and enforcement. He'd haul crates at the warehouse, snapping at a foreman who docked his pay for a late shift. "You rob us, legal-like, but at least I can punch back." Afternoons found him collecting fees from shops, his voice a low rumble that made owners reach for their tills. One time, a baker short-changed him. Mooney flipped the counter, loaves flying like startled pigeons. "Consider that your baking lesson," he said, pocketing the cash with a chuckle that masked the frustration of a man tired of scraping by. His Irish roots, from a family that fled the famine in the 1840s, added a layer of grit. He'd joke about the English weather, worse than home, and that's saying something. But his loyalty to the Blinders was his anchor in a city that often treated immigrants like second-class citizens. Thomas Mucklow, 25 and as wiry as a rat in a trap, was the gang's shadowy architect, his mind a map of opportunities in a city riddled with them. He bunked in a shared tenement, his pallet by a flickering hearth where the fire barely fought off the chill, spending nights sketching routes on pilfered paper by candlelight. "Birmingham's a puzzle. Find the loose piece, and the whole thing falls into your lap," he'd say with a sly wink, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who'd outsmarted debt collectors since boyhood. His sister Mary, 20, was the gang's secret weapon. Her days spent as a laundress with hands chapped from lye, but her nights dedicated to hiding loot in soapboxes or passing notes in folded shirts. "If the law comes knocking, I'll drown 'em in suds," she'd quip, her sarcasm a sharp blade in a world that undervalued women like her. Mary's role grew crucial as Birmingham's suffragette movement stirred, with women like Emmeline Pankhurst rallying for votes in 1903, inspiring her to assert, "We may not have the ballot, but we've got the brains." The Blinders' expansion was a sly creep, like ivy claiming a forgotten wall, turning their alley scraps into a network of gambling dens and protection schemes. They commandeered pubs like the Garrison, a dingy hole with scarred bars and floors sticky as molasses, negotiating with the owner over pints. "We'll keep the peace, for a price," Gilbert said, sliding coins across the counter with a grin that said, "Refuse, and peace becomes a memory." The back room became a hive of activity, cards slapping on tables and dice clattering like chattering teeth, the air thick with tobacco and the occasional curse when luck turned sour. Profits flowed like the rhea in flood season, enough for the gang to buy sharper knives or treat themselves to a mutton pie. Luxury on a shoestring, Mooney would snort, wiping grease from his chin. But success had its pitfalls. One night, a cheater was caught, and Mooney dragged him out by the collar. "Honest crooks only," he growled, tossing the man into the mud with a splash that drew laughs from the patrons. Their clashes with the Birmingham boys escalated into a full-blown feud, a mirror to the city's own tensions. David Taylor, the boys' boss, was a lanky brute with a shaved head and a sneer that could sour milk, his gang feeding on the post-1895 strikes that had paralyzed factories like BSA, where workers demanded fair pay amid rising inflation. The socio-political brew was volatile. Birmingham was a Liberal Party stronghold under Joseph Chamberlain, who pushed municipal reforms like better water supplies in the 1870s. But Small Heath's slums saw little benefit, fostering resentment that the Blinders channeled into their rackets. A 1896 turf war started over a woman named Elsie, a barmaid whose affections sparked a brawl in the Black Horse. The air was a haze of smoke and sweat as fists flew. Gilbert dodged a bottle shattering against the wall. Mooney tackled a slogger twice his size with a thud that shook the tables, and Mucklow smashed a lamp for cover, plunging the room into chaos. "Guess we're redecorating," Gilbert quipped amid the melee, landing a punch that sent a man reeling. The fight spilled onto the street, police whistles piercing the night, and the Blinders held, though Mooney limped home with a gash. Mary patched him up, her voice laced with sarcasm. "You fight like a hero, bleed like a fool." The Blinders adapted to Birmingham's evolving landscape, using the city's rail lines, expanded in the 1830s to connect to London and Liverpool, for smuggling. Mucklow's maps became masterpieces, incorporating new routes around police checkpoints. One heist targeted a coal shipment, the gang sneaking onto a train yard under cover of fog, the air cold and damp. "Like stealing from a sleeping giant," Mucklow whispered as they loaded sacks onto carts. The haul kept their families warm through winter, but a close call with a night watchman left Gilbert with a bruised rib. "Next time, bring a pillow," he joked, wincing. Daily life was a tapestry of grind and glimmers. Gilbert haggled with fences, his mother scolding, "Bring home bread, not bruises." Mooney collected fees, once chasing a debtor into a pigsty, emerging covered in muck. "Smells like success," he laughed. Mucklow scouted, his notebook full. Mary stocked hideouts, her sarcasm sharp. "If the cops find this, I'll say it's a love letter." One evening, a stray cat wandered in, and Mooney named it Lucky, feeding it scraps as a good omen. The socio-political tides shifted with the Boer War in 1899, drawing Birmingham's factories into overdrive for arms, but leaving workers exhausted and the city strained. The Blinders capitalized, smuggling goods past wartime restrictions. Yet, as the decade ended, Taylor's threats loomed larger. "We're in the big leagues now," Gilbert said, his voice laced with caution, "and big leagues bite back." One foggy night, Kimber sat by the river, the waters murmur a sarcastic lullaby mocking his worries. Rain fell lightly, his breath even as he rested, the city's roar fading into a reluctant hush. Part 3. The Peak of Power. From their scrappy origins in the 1880s, the Peaky Blinders had morphed into a formidable force by the 1910s, growing from a handful of alley fighters to a syndicate of 40. Their dominion over Small Heath built on a mix of street smarts and ruthless opportunism, fueled by Birmingham's industrial surge and wartime chaos. As Thomas Gilbert would quip over a pint in the garrison, "We're riding the beast, not taming it. Best hold on tight." The city's industrial maw gaped wider, swallowing men into factories while spitting out the wreckage of war and want, its population swelling to over 840,000 by 1911. Chimneys belched smoke like indignant dragons, stoking Britain's imperial reach across India and Africa. Small Heath, the Blinders' stronghold, was a maze of narrow alleys where horse carts clattered alongside the relentless pulse of the Kinnock works, thickening the air with the sharp sting of explosives and molten metal. Socio-politically, Birmingham simmered. The 1911 Parliament Act had curbed the House of Lords' power, emboldening unions like the Workers' Union, founded in 1889, to demand rights. While the 1913 BSA lockout saw 50,000 workers strike over pay, foreshadowing the manpower drain of World War I, which left widows and orphans haunting the streets. Thomas Gilbert led with a seasoned hand, his leadership a blend of grit and guile, steering the gang through turbulent times with a dry wit that cut like a blade. "Opportunity's a door, kick it down or starve," he'd say, his focus unyielding as he plotted their next move. Kevin Mooney, the gang's enforcer, had honed his fiery temper into a weapon, his presence a warning to foes, his actions a thunderclap in any dispute. Thomas Mucklow, the strategist, kept the gang's plans sharp, his mind a labyrinth of schemes, hiding his relentless drive behind a sly grin. Mary Mucklow, the silent backbone, balanced her days with a laundress's toil and nights hiding loot, her resolve a quiet strength. Harry Fowles, recruited in 1905 for his brawling prowess after fending off the sloggers in a bar, brought his Boer War experience, his limp a badge of survival from South Africa's gold fields. David Taylor, a rival boss since the early 1900s, led the Birmingham Boys, his gang swelled by war vets seeking purpose after naval skirmishes in the 1882 Anglo-Egyptian War. Once, Taylor even poisoned a racehorse. Gilbert's retort still rang. Taylor's tricks outnumber a circus act. Isaac Goldstein, brought in 1912 after Taylor's crew trashed his bakery, joined for his smuggling ties in the Jewish Quarter, a community grown from Russian pogrom refugees since the 1880s. Eliza Hayes, recruited in 1905 after her husband's BSA factory death for her pension managing skills, became the financial mind, her ledgers a fortress of secrets. "Money's a fox, catch it or cry," she'd advise with a sardonic edge. At their peak, the Blinders made a bold leap into horse racing and protection rackets, turning Small Heath into a web of wagers. They insured shops, Mooney collecting with flair. When a grocer shorted them, he upended a crate, vegetables scattering in the grime. "New stock system," he laughed, pocketing cash. Mucklow rigged races at Perry Bar, opened 1890, quipping, "A good fix sells like a good lie." Daily life was a grind of triumphs and barbs. Gilbert haggled with fences. Watches ticked slower than a sloth. Mooney patrolled, once chasing a rival into a pigsty. "Victories smell," he joked. Mucklow scouted new routes. Hayes tallied takings. "Numbers lie. Men lie worse," Goldstein observed. "You're bad weather." To which Gilbert toasted, "You're an umbrella we distrust." The 1914 outbreak of World War I fired up factories, but the 1917 Russian Revolution sparked strikes in 1918 amid shortages. Blinders smuggled rations through back passages, but post-war unemployment soared past 10%, swelling their ranks anew. In 1919, the Epsom clash with Sabini played out like brutal theatre. Sabini, a dapper Italian with a constant cigar, ruled with flair. The racecourse erupted. Flags waved, horses thundered, crowds roared. Blinders moved in, Sabini's men struck back, fists and clubs flew. The turf turned a slick of programs and blood. Gilbert took a rib blow and wheezed, "Hornet's nest," while Fowles charged on, leg aching. Police horns cut through the chaos. The Blinders limped away, Gilbert growling, "Dirt-flavoured win," as Hayes stitched his coat. "You look ploughed." The 1918 Spanish flu claimed thousands leaving haunted streets. Veterans like Fowles carried unseen wounds. PTSD drove many into crime. Blinders filled welfare gaps, Hayes quipping, "Taxmen we hate less." The 1921 Sabini War, Britain's first turf battle, saw Cheltenham's bloody clash, headlines screaming "gang terror." The Blinders held firm, but ground and spirit began to crumble. In early 1922, Gilbert negotiated a truce with Sabini under the market's flickering lanterns. They met at a deserted tea warehouse on a mist-cloaked evening. Gilbert and Sabini, clasping gloved hands while masked men formed a silent cordon. Promises of territory and half-share bets were exchanged beneath dusty rafters. But as the last candle guttered, Sabini gave a subtle nod, and the trap snapped shut. Hidden gunmen emerged from crates. A lantern tipped over, setting hay ablaze in a roaring flare. Bullets cracked off wooden beams. Mooney's roar echoed as he pushed Gilbert aside, taking a round in the shoulder. Gilbert staggered, heart halting, tears of blood at the corner of his mouth. Fowles hurled a chair, smashing a window, letting in the cold air and a hail of sabres. Amid screams and the stench of smoke, Gilbert pressed a shaking hand to his chest and gasped before collapsing onto the splintered floor. Mary Mucklow screamed his name, but Sabini's men melted into the night, leaving nothing but embers and echoes. Gilbert's death fractured the gang irreparably. The Peaky Blinders collapsed. Fowles quit with a bitter laugh. Knives to bread, progress, while Taylor's boys and Sabini carved up the remains. Years later, a lone former blinder stood on a windswept hill, gazing at Birmingham's lights and shadows, raising a silent toast to peaked cap ghosts, whose whispers were lost to the wind. By the mid-1920s, the Peaky Blinders ceased to dominate Birmingham's underworld, not with a single climactic showdown, but through a protracted unravelling, as gradual and inexorable as the city's transition from coal-black powerhouse to bruised industrial heartland. In 1921, Birmingham's population, having peaked at just over 1 million in 1911, dipped to 840,039 1921 census. The Great War's losses and the ebb of wartime production leaving scars deeper than the soot that once blanketed the rooftops. Factories like the Birmingham Small Arms Company, BSA, which had turned out over 2 million Lee Enfield rifles, Vickers machine guns and shells between 1914 and 1918, retooled by 1922 to manufacture 200,000 bicycles annually, while at Small Heath, the red brick terraces echoed less with the jangle of stolen coins and more with the tap-tap of new typists' keys. Following the Sex Disqualification Removal Act of 1919, some 8,500 women found clerical posts in municipal offices and private firms. Across the city, flat-capped men queued by the hundreds for jobs at Austin Motor Company, established in 1905 and turning out 15,000 cars per year by 1928, even as wages stagnated and factories ran at half capacity. The upheaval of October 1929's Wall Street crash struck Birmingham with brutal immediacy. By 1931, unemployment climbed past 20%, compelling 5,000 unemployed workers to join National Unemployed Workers Movement marches down Corporation Street. Former gang affiliates, once enforcers for razor-bladed caps, now held placards demanding food relief at workhouses that ran out of soup. Coal dust in the air gradually gave way to the acrid tang of engine oil, and hope flickered in a nascent labour revival. Ramsay MacDonald's socialist government in 1924 offered the first taste of state intervention, though his 10-month tenure scarcely dented the despair in districts like Small Heath, where children still went to bed hungry. Thomas Mucklow's bullet-riddled death in a Birmingham back alley, April 1922, was more than the fall of a gangland kingpin. It was the final punctuation on a cycle of violence that had begun in the slum pubs of the 1890s. Archival police court ledgers identify Kimber as the chief of the Birmingham Boys, the gang that rose from the Blinders' ashes to wage the so-called racecourse wars at Epsom and Ascot. battles in which bookie stands became makeshift barricades against clubs, lead-studded knuckles, and the roar of 30,000 spectators oblivious to the carnage underfoot. His last words, according to Detective Inspector Herbert Shenton's report, were a boast that he'd go out swinging, though he didn't mention the lead accompaniment. Kimber's slaying came just as British delegates at the 1922 Genoa Conference failed to secure reparations from war-ravaged Germany, leaving Midland's steelworkers idle and local mobs to supply their own justice. Harry Fowles, once the Blinders muscle and a Boer War veteran whose shrapnel-scarred leg forced a lifelong limp, receded into dockyard shadows at Albion Wharf. There he unloaded coal and cotton bales imported from Glasgow and Liverpool, the masts of tramp steamers creaking under the weight of Empire trade. In the Garrison pub, once a Blinders stronghold, he nursed flat ale and recounted engagements from Spy and Cop to Paardeberg, each tale underscoring the bitter irony that men promised homes fit for heroes by Lloyd George's 1919 pledge, now queued at breadlines. The Unemployment Insurance Act of 1920 offered a weekly dole of 28 shillings, barely enough to cover a room in shared tenements where the 1921 census recorded average occupancy of 4.5 persons per dwelling. Into the void stepped David Taylor, a gaunt operator with a glinting scalp, whose Birmingham boys eclipsed their predecessors until the Criminal Justice Act of 1931 and police reforms recommended by the 1919 Desborough Committee for higher wages, better training, and centralized records began to dismantle organized gangs like a house of cards in a gale. Taylor's swaggering insistence that English blood runs thick rang hollow alongside his Irish maternal line. Isaac Goldstein, the Jewish baker who hid illicit gin in flour sacks during America's Prohibition, Volstead Act 1920, navigated the Blinders' collapse with the finesse of a safecracker. His bakery on Duddeston Lane, redolent of oven-warmed challah, served as a front for smuggled spirit, turning out up to 500 gallons of black market gin each month. Goldstein's community, buoyed by waves of Italian and Eastern European Jewish refugees since the 1880s, and tempered by fresh hostility after the 1924 Immigration Act, found solace in places like Singers Hill Synagogue, 1856, whose Moorish arches stood in contrast to the brick facades of Small Heath's terraces. Polly Gray, the Blinders' discreet bookkeeper with hair silvered by years of ledgers, closed her account books for the last time in 1923. She devoted herself to the War Widows' Council and local branches of the Women's Institute, founded 1915, as increasing numbers of middle-class women leveraged the Sex Disqualification Removal Act to enter law, teaching, and civil service. Yet in Small Heath's overcrowded backstreets, where infant mortality in 1922 topped 15 per 1,000, change crawled so slowly that Mrs. Gray often despaired over cups of weak tea. From tallying takings to tallying tears. Progress, I suppose. The Blinders' imprint on Birmingham endured long after their caps lay dusty in pawnshops. Newspapers such as the Birmingham Mail had sensationalized their clipped swagger in the 1890s, while the steel that built the Titanic in 1912, much of it forged in local foundries, reminded the world of British engineering's paradoxes. Triumph and tragedy intertwined. The 1909 People's Budget stoked class antagonism by taxing landowners to fund old-age pensions, and the 1918 Spanish flu, which claimed 228,000 British lives, hollowed out neighbourhoods, pushing more men into the arms of illegal rackets. Even the 1922 Geddes Axe, slashing public expenditure by £87 million, nudged jobless youths towards scrap metal pilfering and armed street fights. When the 1926 general strike halted Birmingham's coal, steel and rail networks for 9 days, former Blinders like Fowles swapped knives for union leaflets. From dodging bullets to dodging bosses, same dance, different tune, he mused as pickets marched past the empty gates of Austin's Long Bridge plant. Others sank into prison, or simply vanished into the anonymity of Britain's interwar churn. Ultimately, the Peaky Blinders were less villains than symptoms, manifestations of a city where Albion's grandeur coexisted with grinding poverty. Their saga underscores how, in an era of boarded-up shops and bread queues, resilience often warped into violence. Modern revivals, from the 2013 Netflix dramatization that transformed the garrison into a themed tourist stop, to Birmingham City FC's Blues moniker and the 1970s Zulu Warriors hooligan firm, recast these men as folk anti-heroes. In truth, the real Blinders were no more than men driven by desperation in a metropolis that glittered for the few and left the many to fight for every crumb. Their faded caps and bent blades lie buried in Birmingham's memory, a poignant reminder that when society falters, fringe flares can burn brightest and burn fastest.